On June 18, 1452, Pope Nicholas V authorized, through the Dum Diverses, the capture of Africans as prisoners of war and trafficked them across the Atlantic and subjugated them to dehumanization processes that resulted in ethnocide. Ethnocide is the loss of identity and place, which is the first harm done by slavery. The word pathologize gives unwarranted credit to actions it describes. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, to pathologize is to view or characterize as medically or psychologically abnormal. The Black family was not the victim of infection. It has been the subject of generational war and policy violence and the denial of full citizenship rights and repair. The period encompassing the illegal and brutal trafficking of our ancestors hundreds of years ago to the present day is a landscape of pain and exploitation. Millions of our people, from the enslavement period to Jim Crow, convict leasing, terrorism, and other domestic abuses against African Americans, continue to plague this country and has found a resurgence in the current moment, amplifying the anti-Black sentiment that has loomed large over the past and the present. Redress must be the outcome to end centuries of harm, not merely the actions of an individual. Pathology obscures our history, blurs the facts, and tries to assign personal responsibility to problems which would otherwise not have existed were it not for the damage done to Africa and its diaspora by way of enslavement, colonization, and neocolonialism. As people that advocate for reparations, we must always remind folks that this problem spans across the entire timeline of the United States' existence. This problem did not die with Abraham Lincoln. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end racism, and the election of Obama did not usher in a new era of justice and repair for the descendants of those captured as prisoners of war and trafficked across the Atlantic for legalized subjugation. Pathology as a supposed explanation for the Black family is itself the product of a racist society. The massive impact of policy violence, not the mythical illness or mythical constraints pathology claims, can be seen across the United States. In the 1940s, the GI Bill denied more than 1 million Black veterans from benefits after serving their country. Medical apartheid, which abused the trust of Black patients, was a series of unethical medical experiments on Black people across this nation. This abuse of health and trust, along with the pseudoscience of eugenics, has contributed to the legitimization of Black pathology. And the redlining of cities like Chicago, which effectuated segregation of living, keeping Black people out of the most prosperous areas of town. In the 103rd District, which I serve, the Champaign County Clerk has led an effort in county government to redress the harms of restrictive covenants. These were legal land documents that, as recently as 1960, were used to keep Black people out of neighborhoods, even as tenants, literally drawing Black people out of the most common way of building wealth, which is home ownership. That kind of economic warfare effectively segregated our local schools, funded by property taxes. Those who pathologize or even try to pathologize Black families either misunderstand history or worse, know history and use this misinformation to prevent progress. Reparations must redress not only the direct financial injustices, but must also reform the systems that made the injustices possible. It is a ridiculous notion to attribute the condition of Black people in America to a physical or mental condition and not the policy and physical violence taken against us for centuries. The foundation of white supremacy sits tenuously on a rickety base of lies and deceptions about how whites gained their wealth and status. A century and a half after slavery, the median wealth of white families is approximately $250,000, but for Black families, it's around $24,000. The belief that white America achieved this 10-to-1 wealth advantage by hard work is an absurd and historical fantasy. Not only do they seek to invent a fraudulent fairy tale that whitewashes a very bloody legacy, but they also aim to reaffirm the notion that non-whites are naturally inferior and lazy and thus responsible for having comparatively nothing. Pathology as a supposed explanation for the Black family is itself the product of a racist society. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for the work that you're doing.
All right, good morning, everyone. So my name is Naomi Simmons-Thorne, and I am a philosopher and doctorate student based at Loyola University Chicago and also here at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I'm also a research associate with the Champaign-Urbana Reparations Coalition. And as a philosopher, I specialize on the topics of ethics and moral philosophy, which encompasses the topic of justice. So as philosophers, we often talk about there being 3 species of justice. So one of those forms of justice is what's called retributive justice. And this is like the punishing of wrongdoers. And that's the kind of justice that we hear about in law and in courts, and also like in our religious upbringing as well. A second kind of justice is another form called distributive justice. And this form of justice is the kind of justice that talks about giving people their fair share in their proportion. And so this is the kind of justice that Marx talks about. It's also the kind of justice that Rawls talks about, if you're familiar with like him and his work. But there's also a third kind of justice that's called rectificatory justice. In other words, rectifying and correcting wrongs. And it is this concept of justice that's at the heart of the reparations movement, but it's also the kind of justice that has been the least thought about in the history of philosophy. So although Aristotle proposes all 3 of these forms of justice, rectificatory justice is the least thought about one. And being at the heart of the reparations movement, it's also unfortunate that it's the most poorly understood. But I think it's really important to say that we shouldn't let, and I often hear this, that reparations is just CRT or DEI, when ancient philosophers in the 4th century BCE was talking about this kind of justice. And so this is not just a modern thing or some kind of modern excess. So when I was tasked with, when I started working with the Champaign-Urbana Reparations Coalition, I was tasked with creating a survey instrument. And the purpose of that instrument was that we wanted it to gather state and local data that we could take to lawmakers and institutions and say, you know, this is why reparations is so vital to your constituents. And the instrument that we developed, it differs from traditional reparation surveys. And so traditionally, reparation surveys will just go around and poll people and ask, do you agree or disagree with reparations? And frankly, as a philosopher, I don't even know what that would mean exactly. But for us, our approach was a little bit different. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to figure out, both in terms of qualitative and quantitative questions, what aspects of reparations is most salient for people. And our survey is embedded in reparations practice and scholarship. And so we have 7 sections of questions that we ask our respondents, but I won't go into all 7 of those questions here, but I do want to talk about 4 of the most important ones. So one of those survey questions is about knowledge of reparations precedents. So we want to know whether our educational institutions, whether our centers of public information is doing a good job of educating residents and citizens, both local and statewide, about reparations precedents, like the one that happened, of course, in Evanston or in Rosewood, Florida, and whether our education institutions are teaching about the principles of international law where, you know, reparations is enshrined in the right to remedy and repair for crimes against humanity. We also wanted to know whether which aspects in categories of harms are most salient in the lives of Illinois descendants of slaves. And so this information is important because on a local and statewide, level, budgets are limited. And while it would be good if we could just shoot a silver bullet and just sufficiently, take care of the reparations problem, that's generally not the case. Some lawmakers are more favorable to doing reparatory action in education as opposed to healthcare and so on and so forth. And so if prioritizing considerations have to be made, we want to be able to tell lawmakers and institutions, well, these are the priorities of your constituents. Thirdly, we also wanted to know about the social histories of Illinois descendants of slaves. And we wanted to ask questions like, do you know about a event that might form the basis of a reparations claim? Which categories of harm have affected your families most saliently? And by virtue of that, which institutions in Illinois are most culpable? And lastly, we also wanted to know which kind of reparatory action that Illinois descendants of slaves, both locally and statewide, what kind of reparatory action are they most interested in? And so we have gathered about 61 respondents from when our survey launched, and that's not a statistically insignificant number. And so analysis on this data is forthcoming, but there are some, I think, preliminary things I can say about it. One of those things is that, one, we are not doing enough to educate our local communities about reparations precedents. And secondly, there is favor granted towards compensation, reparatory actions, and also guarantees of non-repetition. So I think that's really important to say. Having said that, I was also asked to say a little bit of something about the pathologizing of the Black family. And, I often fear that when people are talking about reparations, that listeners get the impression that reparations is like a backwards-looking movement, which it isn't. And so what I wanted to think about was, rather than historical cases and examples of pathologizing the Black family, what does a future without reparations look like for the Black family? And as I was thinking about this, I think I thought about what's called like the Great Wealth Transfer as probably like a really good case. And so if you've never heard of this term being used, the Great Wealth Transfer is this idea that, well, let me back up and say this. So it's estimated that there, between favorable policies like low and free college tuition, home ownership assistance, and these kinds of things, that the federal government essentially generated $120 trillion of personal wealth for baby boomers. And now, as baby boomers are passing, that about 70 trillion of that money will be transferred to millennials in some form or another, which is my generation as a Black millennial. So as a Black millennial, I've seen some of this wealth transfer taking place in real time. So I think about a friend of mine, for example, her and her spouse recently received like a 6-figure inheritance from the passing of a family member. And it's a really interesting when you think about this in contrast, because my spouse, his grandfather passed away 2 weeks ago, and we went to his funeral last weekend. And while we were traveling, I was asking him, well, are you going to be in your grandfather's will? And he said to me, what will? And so this is kind of, the disparity that's going to be like shaping the wealth inequality between Black millennials and white millennials. And so this is pretty pervasive, and it's a really serious issue. And economists argue that by the time that this wealth transfer is done taking shape, that there will be an irreconcilable wealth disparity between Black millennials and white millennials. And if my anecdotal data is any indication, I think it's fair to say that that will be the case. And so I, of course, don't have the answer to this problem. I'm not an economist, but I do know that reparations, is the first step to addressing it. So thank you.